Ficner, for the past 20 years, has devoted a major part, has been involved in major efforts studying and writing about our heritage of government and law, and is also considered penance for the sins he committed helping governments spend billions of our taxpayer dollars. I think he probably wrote this. His attention has been particularly focused on the principles which came to be seen as the essential foundations of civilized behavior and civil government in the long heritage of Western civilization, as well as what our modern democratic governments have done to undermine these principles. He's currently a fellow at the Arthur Meehan Institute for Public Affairs, an independent conservative think tank that is dedicated to the advancement of freedom and prosperity. Charles. Mr. Ficner.
Stay against the wall. Stay against the wall.
Can I put this in here?
Yeah, if it doesn't do a feedback for it.
That's what I was like. Thank you very much. I don't bring the academic credentials. You got to walk right in. I don't bring the academic credentials that John has, but I do bring a very deep study of fundamental principles that emerged in Western civilization and that were best articulated in the British heritage of government and law. One thing I would say about the dangers that one might run into from misunderstanding, even of the things that John said, is that I think we have forgotten what we stand for. We have forgotten the essential values. We also, to pick up on Tom Black's comment, we have people who don't understand this. And if we turn things over to the people, there's a great risk that what they will put in place will be the tyranny of the majority, or they will put in place the wisdom of the day. If I can look at two documents that highlight the problem. One of these you've probably seen. Part 1 of the Constitution Act of 1982. This is the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Many hold that this is the founding document that outlines our basic beliefs, values, and principles. I would comment that this charter, in fact, like the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, was a document concocted at a particular time by a particular group of people for a particular political purpose. It did not properly reflect our deep beliefs, values, and principles. Now, I brought this document with me for a particular purpose, and that was to say that if you look at this, it's not exactly the same as Part 1 of the Constitution Act of 1982. It differs in two respects. One is, it bears the signature of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And the second, far more important thing, is that right above it, there is a quotation that comes from him. It is not formally part of Part 1 of the Constitution Act of 1982. So here's this document that many see as the foundation of our liberties, our freedoms. I'd like to read to you what Trudeau said. This is his addition to the document that he and the premiers and a whole bunch of bureaucrats, federally and provincially, put behind, that they produced from their deep thought. Having done that, Trudeau then says, "We must now establish the basic principle, the basic values and beliefs which hold us together as Canadians. Having produced this, we must now determine our basic beliefs, values, and principles. What is this based upon?" John has commented on some of the elements. I'll speak to another document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, produced in 1948 by the United Nations. Many Canadians attribute this document to a Canadian professor at McGill, John Humphrey, and they think he should have received the Nobel Prize for his work in the early drafts of this. At that time, it was called the Bill of Rights. Humphrey, surprisingly, this is a Bill of Rights, put in this as item 1 in every version of his draft of the Universal Declaration. Every citizen owes a duty of loyalty to the state to which he belongs. What kind of a right is that? The final document, which was then approved by the United Nations, does something else, which is profoundly contrary to the heritage of British government and law. And it's something that we have begun to accept as correct. Article 8 says, having outlined a whole bunch of rights, so-called rights, some of which do reflect the traditional rights that we have understood, the rights of Englishmen that John referred to. Article 8 says, everyone has the right to an effective remedy by the competent national tribunals for acts violating the fundamental rights granted him by Constitution and by law. So in other words, rights are granted. A Declaration of Human Rights, rights don't belong to you because you're human. They are granted to you by Constitution and by law. In which case, if they are granted, they can be taken away. I want to turn now to the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was a document that actually was produced, like our charter, at a very particular time when the king, an abusive king, was having a quarrel with his barons. And the barons, then ultimately with the agreement of the king, concocted a document. And I would maintain that that document does not fully...
We're going to have to take this out because it's making...
They concocted a document which reflected what they wanted to say. It did not fully reflect the heritage. And what was that heritage? It's a heritage that is a very long heritage. It goes back to Cicero, it goes back to Aristotle, it goes back to Plato, it goes back to the ancient laws of Mesopotamia. And in those laws, there is a fundamental belief that is reflected, a belief that underpinned the society. And while this may not be a popular thing to say, it is something that is profoundly important, because it reflects an understanding that law is not made by men. Law exists. We have rights that are given to us by virtue of the fact we are human beings. Though the source of those laws was variously described as the law of nature, right reason, or the law of God, God's law. I'll speak to the notion of God's law for a moment. And whether one accepts God or doesn't accept God, it makes no difference. The premise was there. God created us all. He loved us all equally. He vested us each equally with rights. And he vested us with the duty, the obligation to respect the rights of every other person. The belief in an omnipotent creating God has within it an assurance of our rights as individual human beings. It has within it another premise. An omnipotent creating God created a vast and complex and infinite universe. Infinite means infinite. So no mere man, no group of men, no group of men with the greatest computers and support systems could ever understand that universe in its complexity, let alone manage and control it. We were small in God's universe. We had to respect each other, and we had to respect the earth and the universe. In England, following the departure of the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons came in with a very deep premise, which was fully consistent with that understanding of God's law. All persons had rights. No one could deny them. No one could usurp them. No one could exploit any other person. That's the fundamental premise. If you look at the early laws of England, the ones written by Ethelbert in the 6th century, by Ine, Offa, and others, you will find that those kings documented the laws that respected those rights and that referred to God's law. Alfred the Great, putting together his collection of laws, started out as follows. Now I, King Alfred, have collected these laws and given orders for copies to be made of many of those which our predecessors observed, and which I myself approved. I have not dared to presume to set down in writing much of my own. Law pre-existed. Kings and governments were under the law. And if you look through his compilation of laws, they reflect the Ten Commandments, they reflect ancient Jewish law, they reflect an understanding that we all are equal under God and we have rights given by God. When we turn, I won't go quite to the Magna Carta yet. I will go to Henry II. His Justiciar wrote down a set of laws called Treatise on the Laws and Customs of England. Again, those reflected those ancient, deep laws, not of man's making, not of the convention of the day. And the courts were established under Henry II, the king's courts, and the job of the justices, the king's justices, was in effect to determine, to discover, was the word that was used, what was God's law. What would God do in resolving this dispute? We retain the word discovery as part of our court proceedings, but not in the same sense. But there is that deep understanding that law existed before governments, before man, and the job was to discover it and to uphold it. Those in governments were bound by the trust of the positions they held to uphold that law. John did comment on some of the provisions of the Magna Carta. I will read a couple. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his right or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any way. The king has a duty to uphold that. I'll actually skip on. There are so many that one could cover as examples of this. Now, I will say, I have trouble with the beginning of this clause, Article 61, and as I said, like all charters, it was written by mere men. He says, since we have granted all these things for God, that's a bastardization of the earlier understanding. They were not granted by the king. They were taken on as the trust by the king to uphold. So wording gets important here. So I have some problem with that hastily written charter, just as I do with our own. But here we come. If we, or our Chief Justice, our officials, or any of our servants offend in respect against any man, any persons, or transgress any of these articles of the peace and the security, they shall come to us and declare and claim immediate redress. People have rights, and these rights are backed by the powers granted, acknowledged by the king in the Magna Carta. If we make no redress, the 25 barons may distrain upon and assail us in every way possible, with the support of the whole community of the land, by seizing our castles, our lands, possessions, or anything else, until they have secured such redress as they have determined upon. Hearkening back to King Alfred, the laws of God, the principles of fundamental justice. I could go on and on as to what happened and how these were re-articulated and reconfirmed, Petition of Right, Bill of Right, and how willful kings attempted to undermine them again and again. But I will move instead, because time is of the essence here, to a discussion of where we went wrong, where our system of government and law fell apart. And we have a lot of discussions that really boast about how great Canada is. I think we should look again and see what that heritage actually involves. In the 1750s, a war broke out between England and France. 7 Years' War. As a small peripheral part of that, there was a struggle between England and France for the territories in North America. In 1759, Wolfe defeated Montcalm. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris ceded all the lands, the French lands, to the United Kingdom. Now, the time of that is important, and what happened after is important. Those lands became subject to English law. So England owned not only then the 13 colonies, but all of the former French territories, subject to English law. Willful English parliamentarians and businessmen found that in England they were suffering from costs incurred during the 7 Years' War. And they decided they should profit. So they said, let us deny those in the 13 colonies the rights of Englishmen. Let us prevent them from doing manufacturing. Let us force them to send their products to England so they can be manufactured in England. So they will be the hewers of wood, the drawers of water, the producers of raw cotton. Let them pay taxes. Let them not have representation. And the Americans said, that denies us, as John referred to, the rights of Englishmen. And they rebelled. There were those, Burke concluded, in the English Parliament who